Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the only podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. Your host, Roberto Mazza, will bring you guests discussing their relationship with the Holy City. A journey through history, society, feelings, and hopes for the future. Follow the podcast on all social media platforms at Jerusalem Unplugged.
Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the first and only podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. It is my pleasure today to host Mona Hajjar Halaby. She is the creator of a Facebook page, British Mandate, Jerusalemites Photo Library, and of the Palestine Ethnographic Society. She is also been collaborating to the interactive documentary, Jerusalem, We Are Here. Mona is also an upcoming book, In My Mother's Footsteps, a Palestinian refugee returns home. Before we start our conversation with Mona, I would like to invite all of the listeners to join the Facebook page British Mandate Jerusalemites Photo Library, as it is an amazing tour to look and stare at the pictures of Jerusalem throughout the Mandate era. Mona, welcome. And thanks for being with us today. My first question is the same to all of the guests of Jerusalem Unplugged. What is your Jerusalem? In other words, what is your connection to the city?
My connection to Jerusalem is my mother. She is the conduit that led to my passion for Jerusalem. I never lived in Jerusalem except for a year when I was teaching at the Ramallah Friends School. And otherwise, I only heard about Jerusalem from my mother's stories. And she was so passionate as a refugee who lost her home in 1948. She spoke about Jerusalem in such a lively and vivid way that I felt as though I had been there with her. So this was the beginning of my love affair with Jerusalem.
Would you be able to share some of the stories that your mom told you about Jerusalem?
Well, first of all, she talked about it with so much joy. Many Palestinian refugees avoid talking about the past to their children and grandchildren because their past is filled with the sorrow of losing their homeland. And of course, my mother was terribly sorry and sad and mourning the loss of her home in Lower Ba'a in Jerusalem. But besides that sorrow, there was a very large component that was about the joy and the beauty of living in a multicultural, pluralistic society where internationals mingled with natives, languages. There were several languages spoken. There was culture. There was a lot of activities that created a society that was rich in history. And my mother was a part of that. She attended the German colony Templar school, created by the Templars when they came from Stuttgart in 1869 to Palestine to start a community in Haifa and in Jerusalem. Her parents wanted her to have a progressive modern education. Her father, my grandfather, had studied at the University of Geneva in 1911. And that was sort of, it wasn't unheard of, but it was very modern, that he was able to get his education in social sciences in Europe. And he chose Switzerland because he did not want to study in one of the colonizing countries. So he avoided the French and the British. He chose for his three children an education in a German school, because one, it was non-sectarian. It was not a religious school. My grandfather was Muslim and my grandmother was Catholic, which also was a very unheard of thing in the Middle East in that period. And it's still something that's frowned upon to this day. But in 1918, my grandparents got married and were totally approved by both sides of the family. And my grandmother was 8 years my grandfather's senior. So she was 38, he was 30 when they got married. So you can see that there was just a great deal of modern thinking, tolerant thinking. And they met and they fell in love, and they were very much intellectuals who had common interests and ideologies. They were very much against the colonial powers, the British mandate. They were also very anti-Zionist, and they instilled all these things in my mother. And some of her stories were about her education in a very, very modern family. My grandfather was the editor of Al Hayat, a newspaper that was published, a daily, that was published in 1930, that started publishing in 1930. And at the dinner table with his wife and 3 children, he would bring up letters to the editor that were sent to him. And he would ask their opinion, which, you don't often hear fathers doing that necessarily. And whenever one of his kids would give their opinions, he would say, now, why do you think that? There was always the why. He wanted to understand their critical thinking. And he encouraged a lot of that critical thinking, the skills to defend your opinion and your perspective. So from hearing my mother telling me all these stories, I had a great sense about Jerusalem and its urban intellectuals and its education system, and my grandparents and the role they played in my mother's life. And of course, all of that was very, very exciting for me to hear about. It made me feel close to them.
Often you hear of Jerusalem as painted often by European scholars, as this like city in the backwaters of the Ottoman Empire before, and then also of the British Empire when the British took over. But what you channel through the memory of your mother shows a complete different setting, a different city from sort of the stereotypical pictures that we get of Jerusalem. And I really want to move to your work and the question of photography. In your work, you looked at Jerusalem through photography, so through the collections of pictures. And I was wondering, when you're gazing, when you're staring at that material, how does Jerusalem look like in black and white?
Well, I like it in black and white more than in colors, to be honest with you. To me, it's the authentic Jerusalem, because that's sort of frozen in time. It is the Jerusalem my mother grew up in. It was the Jerusalem that was multicultural and that was rich in history. Not that it's not rich in history now, but it is different. And so when I look at photographs, and I grew up very fortunate to have already a large collection of photographs, because my mother's brother Afif was an avid photographer, amateur photographer. And he took pictures of all of the picnics and gatherings and family occasions, but friends and public occasions. And when he had to leave Jerusalem because they were being driven out by the bombing in their neighborhood, he took all of his pictures and his camera, and he documented his own Nakba, unknowingly, of course. He photographed himself with my mother at the bus station, waiting for the bus that was going to take them to Cairo. And that was the last time they were standing on Palestinian ground. And all of those photographs, depict a world that was documented by my uncle. And after that, I happened to marry a Palestinian whose father was an avid photographer. And so then I inherited a tremendous amount of, pictures, tremendous number of pictures of Jerusalem and all of the outings and family events that my husband's family experienced. And so I ended up with huge collections. And when I looked at the pictures, I could understand better the culture and the space and time. And in 2014, I decided to research my mother's past so that I could write a book about her life in Jerusalem. And I used a Facebook community page to share photographs. And I entitled it British Mandate Jerusalemites Photo Library. And I chose that name because that is the period, more or less, the first half of the 20th century. Of course, I cover also photographs from the late Ottoman period. And I started it because I wanted to research my mother's story and make connections with other Palestinians who may have also experienced my mother or similar stories. And it has become not only a place for my own research, but also a gathering place. It has become a place where Palestinians in the diaspora have been able to connect with each other, with uncles and aunts and siblings. And it's been a source of pleasure for me to see that we are united, even if we are not standing on our land, that even at a distance, we can all feel connected. And of course, pictures can tell a story better than, 1,000 words. And without my saying very much about that historic period, but instead by showing photographs and telling stories of people who lived during that period, I am also educating people as to the culture and the richness of that culture of Jerusalem. Because most people have an image of Palestinians, which I understand is totally valid. The pictures they've seen of Palestinian refugees walking away from their raised villages, carrying a satchel of clothes, carrying their babies, and running away from the bombing, those pictures are real because 70% of Palestine was an agrarian society. But I think people tend to forget that there were the urban centers like Jaffa and Jerusalem and Haifa being the three biggest, that there were urban Palestinians that lost a great deal. In Jerusalem alone, there's 50,000 Palestinians who lived in West Jerusalem primarily, who lost their properties and homes. And I think that by showing that, I'm also reminding people and educating people about the urban Palestinians. So photographs are very important in my own research of that world.
I want to ask you something about feelings. I must admit that I'm a huge fan of your Facebook page, and whenever you publish something, I'm always opening all of the pictures. And in time, I start appreciating what those pictures are telling me beyond the professional interest to find something connected to the period I'm working on. And I spend more and more time reading comments. And as you mentioned, people learn how to connect with each other to provide information about an individual, a shop, a building. And it's fascinating how this social media tool brought people together. But my question is very personal. How do you feel in terms of personal feelings when you see all of these debates moving forward? When you bump into a picture that might be connected to your family, or a face that is also familiar because it connects to the stories that your mom told you?
It is very, very gratifying. My feelings are, really joyful. It's like I'm meeting a dear old friend that I haven't seen for so many years, even though most of the people I don't know. But some people are children or grandchildren of people my mother was friends with. And so there's the joy of connecting with her friends and her community. It's almost vicariously enjoying what she had in Jerusalem. I wasn't there to experience it firsthand, but I'm certainly experiencing it secondhand now through the generations that followed and that are, scattered around the world.
I want to dig a little bit into the pictures because you posted so far probably thousands of them. I was wondering if there's any particular story that stand out, stories that you felt very passionate about, connected to those images.
Because I'm an educator, retired now, but I taught for 30 years and I trained teachers for 30 years. I feel that a lot of the pictures that I've posted about schools in Jerusalem have meant a great deal to me, because I wanted to, first of all, indirectly show that Palestinians, urban Palestinians, were very educated, and that their education really ended up helping them become the next generation of employees in either the British Mandate government, the Secretariat, or in other institutions. That this foundation of education, which was primarily French or English, gave them a platform, and they were able to perform in the diaspora after the British Mandate ended and the Nakba occurred. So I think of education as being those pictures of schools that I've posted, and people's stories around the schools, meaning a great deal to me personally. And then I enjoy writing about different families who have shared their stories with me. I mean, recently I put up the story of Shukri Deeb and his wife, Katingo Hanania. These are names of very, illustrious people, a family that was well known and had roots in Jerusalem and in the business of Jerusalem as well. And it was a great joy to publish that story, because a lot of the grandchildren of Shukri and Katingo connected with it, and I got most of the information from one of the granddaughters of Shukri and Katingo. So to be able to put out the story of a family, I'm noticing that appeals to people a great deal more than something a little. For instance, my most recent post was about the first landing of an airplane in Jerusalem. And it did not interest as many people, because they like real family stories and people stories. Mine was more, this one was more a story of a first, and about aviation. And of course, they were French who landed there, not Palestinians, not the Arabs. But I noticed that people are less interested in something like that versus a family from Jerusalem. But I like to have a little variety and put different things in.
Well, I think this shows the interest for the human aspect of Jerusalem. We know so much about buildings. We know so much about every single stone that has been placed and displaced, particularly in the old city. And I think this is refreshing to see that people are more interested in the human aspects, individuals, peoples, families. And I think this is like, a good way of thinking about the memory of a city.
Yes.
To the extent that I really want to ask you, have you ever met any form of opposition to your work, of criticism?
Not directly. I think that there are some comments that are political, which I immediately delete, because I did say in a very direct way in my about section on the British Mandate Jerusalemites that I will not tolerate any political debate. There are other pages on Facebook that love the political debate. I'm not interested in that. I think it is best to just show through pictures the culture, and for us to look at the pictures as a form of socialize, well, not socializing, but almost like a dissection, a social dissection of the society at that time. And what did people wear? What vehicles did they have? What did this mean symbolically? And I've deleted a number of comments because people, even though I say that on my page, people still have reactions and want to disparage Israel, or Zionism, which is not something that I want to get involved in. This is not the purpose of the page. I think the message of the page is really the human, social history of Jerusalem.
And I think you've been very innovative in this. I mean, as a professional historian, I know that we, certainly in the past, things are changing now, but there's been so much focus on the national struggle, the emerging conflict, the politics, and often we forgot about the people. And the social history of Palestine and of Palestinians has been emerging only recently, and I think your work really fits, and more importantly, provide a face to Palestinians, to people that live there, and as you mentioned earlier, really experienced the Nakba firsthand and also recorded those moments. So certainly that's very innovative, and I think we historians should be really thankful of your work in that sense.
Thank
Now,
you.
I want to ask you something because it's connected to your work. A few years back, you published a very interesting article on the Jerusalem Quarterly, where you discuss photography. And as you mentioned earlier, you talked about, in the article, about these picnics, Jerusalemites leaving the old city or the city center and going out. I was wondering if you can tell us about it. What was happening there? Why did people leave? What was this, sort of love for picnics?
Well, it started with the fact, I guess, the Jerusalemites lived in the old city before they expanded outside of the walls. And it was a very crowded place to live, surrounded by stones. So there was very little greenery. And people wanted to get out of the city, and they would go to Jericho and to Jaffa, and Jericho for the beauty and the warmth and the vegetation, and Jaffa for the beach. And then even when they started to move out of the old city and moved into the new city, the suburbs, they continued on this tradition of going on outings. They brought their food with them, and they sat, on the ground or on the beach, and they ate their food. And it wasn't sandwiches the way people think of for picnics, but they brought actual pots of stuffed grape leaves, anab, and they would sit and eat actual meals that you would sit at the table, would have at the table. And so they they've always loved the land. I mean, don't forget, it's an agrarian society. The land meant a lot to them. And if you've been to Palestine, you know that there is a beauty to those terraced hills, with stones and olive wood trees. And it's just beautiful. So I can appreciate their love for that. And then they would get back to the city and go through their work or their studies and then look forward to the next outing.
I was wondering if your mother mentioned and talked about these picnics, if there's some sort of personal aspects or anecdotes that you can link to your discussion of, outing, picnicking outside the city walls.
Yes, my mother has many. I have many, many photos of my mother on those picnics with all of her friends. And yes, she remembers very much the one where they went to Jericho and then hiked up to the Mount of Temptation. And up there was a sort of a platform. They brought with them a phonograph, and then they brought records, and they danced up there. And she still remembers that with so much joy. She loved music and sang a lot. And so that picnic was sort of one that stood out in her mind. And because it was in the early 40s when World War II was happening, private cars were not allowed to circulate. There was a curfew on private cars circulating. So all of not that young people had cars, but a few of them could borrow their parents' cars. But that time when they went to Jericho, they rented a truck and they all sat in the back of the truck. And there are a few pictures of them standing in the back of the truck. And they went up to Jericho with that truck and had this glorious, legendary picnic and dance party.
Well, it's fascinating, given that you probably heard of the story of a party that took place at the Nebi Musa location, not far away from Jericho. Many have criticized that for various reasons, but certainly, the story of your mom shows that partying outside, particularly music and food, was common even before. So we shouldn't be surprised of youth and younger people going out and coming together. I want to stay and discuss a few things about your mother and obviously your upcoming book. You mentioned food. And I was wondering if your mother ever talked about food to you, and if there's any food that left some recipes or flavors, colors, taste. Food is very important in Jerusalem in many ways, and also defines a specific cuisine of Jerusalemites. And I was wondering if here there's something to add.
I would say my mother loved to cook and fed us very, very well. And her mother was a great cook as well. My mother loved to make, for instance, mlochie, which is the jute plant. It's a kind of like a spinach plant, but that you put in, that you cook in broth and with chicken and pour over rice. This was one of her favorite dishes, and she cooked that a lot. Stuffed grape leaves, stuffed squash, stuffed eggplants, lots of stuffed vegetables, and kubbe, which is made with burghul and meat. And sometimes she would make the kubbe with the laban in a sauce, in a soupy yogurt sauce, and it was very, very delicious. But it's interesting. Food was important, but my mother often talked about the food for the mind. And because she came from a family that was intellectual, that was interested in the world of ideas, the food you put in your mouth was important, but to really be nurtured, you also needed the food that came from your mind and your ideas. So, I wouldn't say that cooking was by itself a huge thing the way it is for many Palestinian families. I think my mother's family put it on the same level as food for thought.
You mentioned while talking about picnics, obviously food, but also music. And this is a very interesting aspect. Are you aware of what music they were listening to? I mean, other probably than Kulthum, which was the star of the moment. But are you aware of other music, whether they were influenced by Western music or they preferred more Arabic music? If there was any particular radio station, for instance, they were listening to, or a song?
Well, the major radio station was the Palestine Broadcasting Service, and they listened to that. But my mother and her two brothers belonged to the YMCA. My uncle Afif, whom I've mentioned earlier as the photographer in the family, was an avid lover of the swing big band music. It was the time of Glenn Miller's music and those kinds of songs. And he was in a band at the YMCA, and they often played in the lounge or once in a while in the auditorium. And my mother sang. She was their singer, not every time, but she had a beautiful voice, and sang to an audience of 800 people in the auditorium. So they liked that sort of music. They were young people. It was the early 40s, and that was sort of the popular type of music that they enjoyed. So they were influenced by Western music more so. They listened to Arabic songs too, but they did not perform them.
Do you think your mother missed Jerusalem somehow?
Oh, yes, all the time. She talked about it as though it was another person. She talked about Jerusalem as though it was her best friend, and she missed her best friend since she left in 1948. And she would often say, I want to go back home. Of course, for her, home was Jerusalem, but it was also all the other homes she ended up losing in her life, because she lost her home twice, once to the creation of the State of Israel, and then she lost her second home to the nationalization of Egypt in 1961. And then she lost her Geneva home, because we ended up living in Switzerland, in Geneva. She lost that when she had a stroke and was hospitalized and had to stay in a rehab center. She could not go back home. So when she used to say, I want to go home, and I'll share a little anecdote that's in my book, she had to wear one of those little clip-ons that have a little red light at the end of it, and it's wrapped around the finger to measure the oxygen saturation levels. And so she had that taped on her finger, and occasionally she would want to have me touch that, the two of us touch each other's pointers, and she would say, E.T., go home. And it was so endearing. That was my mother. She thought of symbols, she thought of ideas, and even after the stroke, she could fortunately still talk with the stroke. She couldn't move, and she couldn't swallow very well. So she would say, E.T., go home. And we knew that home was everything: Jerusalem, Egypt, and her home in Geneva.
It's fascinating and moving at the same time. I just have a couple of questions, before reaching the conclusion of this episode. I was curious about this documentary that you mentioned, Jerusalem, We Are Here. And I was wondering if you can just tell us more about it.
Yes, for sure. I'll tell you what happened. I was approached by an Israeli-Canadian academic who teaches at Queen's University in Canada. Dorit Naman is her name, because she had heard that I knew a lot of families from Jerusalem, and she was starting this project where she was focusing on the neighborhood of Katamon as and looking back at certain houses, certain families, institutions that were there, and doing it through um, Google Street View and using other, technological pieces, which I didn't understand very well because I'm not in film, but she is a film professor. And so with that tool, we were able, she asked me to be the English narrator in the documentary. It is interactive because people can join a tour. And there's an Anwar who did the tour in English. I did it in Arabic, and I did it in English. And people can choose tours that they can follow. And I walk through the streets and talk to them, and then we get to a house, for instance, and either there's a video about that we took of the people who lived in that house, Palestinians, during the 30s or 40s, or we have an institution and we have some write-up about it, so, or photographs. So you get the chance to view Katamon on several levels, the current streets through Google Street View, and the level that is below it, historically, the level of Katamon in pre-1948. And I had amassed a number of photographs of houses in Baka and Katamon and Talbiye that belonged to Palestinians pre-1948, with the help of an elderly man who pointed out this was the house of this family, this was the house of this man. I took pictures and documented those houses and put them on a Google map. Well, when Dorit invited me to join her, she asked if we could have then, as a part of Jerusalem We Are Here, a remapping of Jerusalem and using my map and expanding it to include more and more dwellings and biographical information. And this is what we did. And so now we have maybe 200 houses or more that have been identified on the map. And we encourage people, because it is an interactive process, to give us information that we could add, or to provide us information with other houses which we haven't identified. So it's a really great tool because you're working with the past and the present, and you're working with people who can offer more information. It's a so a social history at its most critical way, because it is incorporating the past and the present.
Talking about the present, I was wondering, what is your relationship with modern day Jerusalem?
Well, I go to Jerusalem and visit it. I live in California, so it's a long ways, but I go regularly. I used to go almost every year. Now I'm not, with COVID, of course, traveling, but I have a relationship when I go there that I feel totally at home, even though I was not born there. I did not grow up there, but I am from there, and I feel it. I feel it in every street I walk on, every stone building sort of has a piece of my history embedded in it. And it is because my mother has so vividly described everything to me, skipping into Jaffa Gate to go see her grandmother, who lived right behind the Greek Catholic Church in the old city. I can just see all these things as though they were superimposed onto the modern Jerusalem. And I usually stay in the old city, in the Armenian quarter. I have a friend who has a house that I can rent there. And I'm totally engulfed I hear those beautiful bells, church bells ringing. I hear the melodious sound of the muezzin calling people to prayer. And I feel as though, I am living in the past. My mother would often say, "Stop living in my past." And I would say, "But your past was wonderful. You've created such a great image of it." But of course, there's the reality when I'm in today's Jerusalem, the reality of the constant annexation and occupation of Palestine, and all of that, of course, makes me very sad. But I have so many other joyful memories; they overtake it.
One last question. Do you have any favorite spots when you wander around the city? Is there anything that you just stare and makes you feel even more connected with the city? Something that brings you, the wave of memories that you talked about?
There are two places, if you'll allow me to share two. One is a staircase that goes up to the rooftops of the street, David Street or Bazaar Street, right above there, where you're on top and see all the domes of the dwellings around. You have an amazing view of the city, especially the Dome of the Rock. And I write in my book how when I am up there, I don't see any divisions because the sky is everyone's sky. It's not the Israeli sky or the Palestinian sky. And when I see those pigeons, there are a lot of homing pigeons in Jerusalem, I feel I am envious of their freedom because they can go anywhere. And we humans are rooted to where we stand. And when I'm up there, I feel a sense of connectivity with the city, whether it's daytime or nighttime. Nighttime is even more beautiful. And in my book, I describe going up there with my late husband and enjoying that scene there. We felt totally at home when we were up there. The other one is when I sit in the Greek Catholic Church, which was my mother's church. My mother's family was Greek Catholic. And it's not very far from the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate. And that church is filled with floor-to-ceiling frescoes that are very brightly colored, modern looking. So I'm not sure how long ago the church was renovated, but the characters are all from biblical stories. And the dome is gorgeous if you ever see it. In my book, I have pictures of it. And it shows you not only the beauty of, I'm not a religious person in everyday life. I'm more of a spiritual person. But when I'm in there, I feel connected to that side of Jerusalem, which is a place of worship for the three monotheistic religions. And when I'm in there, I feel connected. It was my mother's church where she grew up. She sang in the choir. My grandmother's funeral was held there. There are all of these connections to the place. And so my being in that church awakens these deep spiritual longings for the place and the time. So these two places, I think, would be the two that I would focus on as being two of my favorites.
Thank you. Thank you for being a guest on Jerusalem Unplugged. Mona Hajjar Halaby, I want to remind the listeners, the creator of a Facebook page, British Monday Jerusalemites Photo Library, but more importantly, author of the upcoming book, In My Mother's Footsteps, A Palestinian Refugee Returns Home. Thank you, Mona. And to the listeners, you can follow us at all of our social media platform at Jerusalem Unplugged. Thank you.
Thank you.